Call me, D.
Virginia sits at the top of the South and the bottom of the North. So for a long time, the city didn't have its own identity. We've heard stories from Baltimore, Atlanta, DC, and the list goes on. Most of our city's history is lost in graveyards or locked away in a prison. So I don't tell you these stories to glorify the street life. I want the youth of the day to understand who their fathers were, their mothers' fathers were. And we today are descendants of those stories. So if you're a Richmond native, this is what you come from. Because there's a time in history where the streets was saw as the only way out for us, to us. Especially when something has kept you fed, protected, warm, and alive. Because we all have an instinct to survive. And during these times, everything was about survival. Richmond at War, 1990.
I live through the earls of the browns and flats. Roll on you, go to the street with no code on you. By the time they felt your body, you had mold on you.
There was always one story among the others you would hear bits and pieces about growing up, and that was the war inside Blackwell back in the 90s. City officials could only prove on paper that 25 lives were lost directly due to this war, but the real number was believed to be as many as 70. But to get the story in its entirety, I gotta take you back 50 years into the past to meet the boy that Richmond dubbed the teenage Hitman. That young man's name is Rakie Cloyd, born in New York on September 7, 1970. His mother, Barbara Taylor, was only a teenager at the time of his birth, with her actually having 3 other children before Rakie's arrival. So she wouldn't be able to finish high school, but eventually she received a General Educational Development Certificate later down the line. It was a common struggle inside this community, and we've seen it too many times to count. Rakie's dad, whose name is unknown, would father all 4 children with Miss Taylor. And because of his active drug problem at the time and multiple drug violations, Barbara would leave the toxic relationship with him and move to her new home in Richmond, Virginia. And by the time she arrives, she had severed all ties with Rakie's father. Now, after Barbara gets settled into the city, she would attend a local community college and eventually become a medical assistant. She had a good job, but still, her income would fall short most months. Her paycheck wouldn't equate to what it took to support herself and 4 children. They lived on the east end of the city, and despite what seemed like a typical scenario of a healthy but struggling one-parent family, it's alleged that things were happening to Rakie on a daily at home. In terms of neglection, verbal and physical abuse, which would always be denied when Barbara was questioned about it. But from an overall outside view, Rakie had an average childhood with the exception of severe whoopings and punishment when he got into trouble. And it seemed as if trouble followed Rakie around, no matter where he'd go. But like most kids, you find ways to escape and still have fun through those dark times. Football was one of his favorite sports back then, and he played day in and day out with his friends around the neighborhood. But among Rakie's several punishments, one included denying him permission to do the activities he enjoyed, which is expected when a child is misbehaving. But because he misbehaved so often, it only elevated those negative feelings toward the place he called home. And the age gaps between him and his siblings didn't help. He'd feel alone sometimes, even under the same roof with his older brother Tyrone Cloyd, who is currently a Marine. His 2 sisters were in their mid to late teens, and his mother would meet another man who moved in as well. Rakie also had a half-brother close in age but lived with his father in Mechanicsville. So like majority of the black children in this specific situation from any hood nationwide, eventually he would gain an extended family from the streets. Meanwhile, there were several wars brewing on all sides of the city. So in order for the millennial generation to exist today, our parents, who were majority teens and preteens at the time, had to survive. There was a 20-year-old man named Eugene Johnson, aka Radio, who lived in Blackwell on East 12th Street, located on the Southside. His nickname came from the way he spoke. In an article published in 1991, it says, and I quote, "He can still pepper a room with words fired as hot, fast, and hard as bullets from a Uzi. His racing tongue, sometimes a step too quick for his thoughts, confused and choppy sentences merged as he runs on in a whiny monotone that earned him the street name Radio." Now Eugene, he comes from one of the 3 families, the Johnsons, Browns, and Flacks. Before the beef kicked off, it's alleged that the Johnsons and the Flacks were actually cool with one another. And for the people outside of Richmond that may not know of the Johnson-Brown story, the Johnsons and Browns are made up of 2 separate families. They were also alongside others who were close but not blood related. So with each person moving as one, city officials eventually named them the Johnson Brown Gang. It's unclear if they named themselves, because we all know that the news articles and police task force can be infamous for titling a group of people a specific name. But just so you'd have a clear understanding of who's who, Johnson and Brown Gang is what we'll go by during this story. Now, there are several rumors throughout the streets till this day on why the Johnson and Flax families fell out with one another. One theory is, some time ago, there were individuals from both sides going on a lick together, and as the mission comes to an end, there was said to be some sort of foul play involved as far as the money side of things. Another theory, one day they were friends who sat around drinking together, and several weeks later, they were trying to kill each other over drug deals that went bad. But it isn't my place to say which rumor is truth or lie, because the streets talk, and word of mouth itself could totally change the story's origin by the time the third person passes it on to the fourth. But what we do know to be good old-fashioned facts is that years back, before any blood was shed, it was one-on-ones, pack-outs. One member might spot the other side out at a nightclub, thus turning what was once a party into an all-out brawl. But this rivalry would escalate between members from opposing sides, which were Daniel Flax and Eugene Johnson, after Eugene accidentally kills an innocent 18-year-old girl during a shootout. On the night of December 5th, 1982, Lisa Dean Fauntleroy, who lived on 2103 Harvey Road, was leaving the Ebony Island nightclub on North Avenue. Alongside her was a man named James Bowers, and upon making his way to the vehicle, he saw Eugene inside the parking lot. So apparently they had a previous business agreement with each other that wasn't honored by Eugene. So James confronted him about an alleged $250 drug debt. The tension was obvious, which led to both men engaging into an argument. James, now wielding a pistol, he fires several shots at Eugene, and the man who accompanied Eugene tosses him a gun, prompting him to fire 2 shots back at James in self-defense. Surprisingly, both shots would make contact, with one only wounding James in the stomach, but the other would hit Lisa, and her wound would be a headshot, killing her instantly. Eugene flees the scene, and about 2 weeks later, he surrendered himself to the police after being found at a house at 6700 Patterson Avenue. Days after his arrest, he was arraigned on charges of slaying a woman and wounding another. His fate was to be decided at trial in the month of March in that following year, 1983. Paid with the unknown amount, Eugene was able to bond out. It's now February, 2 months into the new year of 1983, and there was an incident during a concert that officially started the war between the Flax and the Johnsons family. But before this would actually take place, it said that Eugene received backlash from the Flax family about the shooting that took a young girl's life not too long ago. But why? Was James Bowers an associate of the Flaxes, or was Lisa a relative of theirs? An answer I wouldn't be able to find, but that tension between the two escalated when both parties wound up at a concert together. Now, there were various artists performing at the Richmond Coliseum during the month of February, and among them were only 2 artists I could imagine a group of black folks showing out to see, which were Prince and James Brown. Eugene would be in attendance, but so was Daniel Flax and a friend of his named Ernest Trent. During the concert, Eugene and Daniel got into a fight, prompting the guys from both sides to get involved. At some point, Eugene draws down on Daniel with a handgun, but Daniel, just in time, kicked the weapon out of Eugene's hand. Both sides retreat, but the fight was far from over. So now, off the back of an accidental shooting, a disagreement, and a physical fight that almost turned deadly between both sides involved, a green light was now activated. Now moving on to the following month of March, Eugene will go to trial, stand before a jury of his peers for the murder of Lisa Fauntleroy and the aggravated assault of James Bowers from the previous year. During his testimony, he admitted to killing Lisa on accident, saying he didn't even know the woman was shot until some time after. He further testified the reason he fled the scene was out of fear of retaliation from James Bowers' friends. Now, one may think that no gangster in history would actually admit to being scared of their enemy in open court. There's no proof if the friends he's speaking of is a part of the Flax family, being that they had an argument over the shooting. Now, anyone would expect for him to be done for, thinking there's no way he could duck a charge that blatant. But even the judge himself was shocked after hearing the jury's decision. Everyone stands to hear the verdict, and the jury unanimously found Eugene Johnson not guilty. I've come to the conclusion that had he been brought up on charges of manslaughter, he would have been arrested that very day. Or maybe cops were just too single-minded to think that a guy like Eugene would be smart enough to hire an actual lawyer. A lawyer who would even end his closing argument with this statement to the jury, and I quote, "Remember, Johnson's fate is in your hands. Because no matter what Eugene Johnson was doing in the streets before this incident, this case was simply that. An accidental shooting that got an innocent person killed. Now, in my most humble opinion, because James confronted Eugene with Lisa being alongside him, he should bear the guilt before anyone. But not everyone shared the same sentiments. As Lisa's mother, Laverta, would say in a telephone interview, "I couldn't get out of my car after the trial because I'm just so confused. We're all just staring into space. He tells people that he shot my daughter and that it was an accident, and the jury believes him. My family is very upset because my daughter didn't do anything. She was only 18. I'm hurting, I'm suffering, and I can't function during my job. He didn't get 1 day. Maybe the jurors haven't been through something like this, but death is not a small matter. This is the worst incident in my life. He killed my daughter and he still walks the streets." Marking down Lisa Fauntleroy as the first casualty amid this deadly war. Now, as we check back in on East End with Rakie Cloyd, the early months of '83 were more than horrible for him, because not only would he receive beatings from his mother, but her boyfriend, who's now in the home, would strike him as well. A motive on why she let this happen to her son is unknown, but Rakie's reaction would always be to roam the streets. Either it be to escape or find a more loving and attentive home to fulfill his adolescent needs. But Rakie does come to a breaking point. A point where as though a light had switched on inside his mind, but the opposite will happen inside his heart, which would take place 6 months from now after his 13th birthday. So in between those 6 months, one of their main players from the Johnson and Brown gang would take a hiatus from the streets after the war going on in Blackwell got worse, where Eugene would spill first blood against the Flax family. On May 24th, 1983, Daniel Flax planned to meet his girlfriend Debbie Pritchett on 2nd and Broad Street at the Towelhammer's Westmoreland store downtown where she worked. But first, he wanted to pick up some dinner. So he drove to a fish market nearby, which was across the street from a jewelry store. He made way to his vehicle after receiving his food and didn't notice the cars following him for the past 10 to 15 minutes. So now back inside his car, he was just seconds from pulling away. But not before a man named Sylvester Montague, an associate of Eugene, walked down on him at his driver's side window. Wasting no time at all, he puts 3 bullets into Daniel. But before he could react, a car pulls up next to him. Popping out the car was none other than Eugene Johnson himself. Making sure the hit was completed, he runs down on the car as well. All happening on the busy Broad Street strip during the rush hour. But Daniel wasn't down. Even after 2 attempts within seconds from each other, Daniel then drove himself to MCV where doctors treated him. Now he made a full recovery, and after 3 weeks he was able to go home in the middle of June of '83. Now about 2.5 months later, Rakie turned 13 years old on the 7th day of September, still living on the east end of town. By now he was more street smart than your average teen, but was considered small for his age. Hearing loss plagued his left ear, and his grades at Mosby Middle School had seen better days. But for Rakie, it was difficult to arrive at school ready to learn with no positive reinforcements on the home front. Then on from his front door to the bus stop, he had to walk through a neighborhood that felt long forgotten by its city. The crack epidemic was at its infancy stage, slowly taking its course, and kids like Rakie Cloyd would be all but collateral damage. So adding on the fact that his biological dad was a permanent no-show, it truly left this 13-year-old boy emotionally crippled. So as he spent more and more time outside, Rakie was able to maneuver amongst the older guys. Now throughout my research, it said that back in the 90s, the city's drug dealers seemed to have a simple system for drawing young men to their ranks. It's a system based on teenage desires and peer pressure. Before Rakie's time, those desires may have led to drug abuse or drinking, but now they're leading to murder. And Rakie was just another pawn in our city's history of street wars. Even today, we're desensitized to the thought of kids being killers. And the early 80s to the mid 90s is when most of it started. There's a lot of Rakies out there. They just have different names. The rumors of abuse inside the home will be brought out to the forefront because on October 28, 1983, Rakie claimed that his mother was abusing him, saying she had struck him with a broomstick. The day this occurred, Rakie would leave the home on his own, as he did most days after an abusive altercation with his mother or her boyfriend. So later into the night on the same day, a call was made at 11 p.m. by a patrolman named McMahon. He was at the home of Jesse Turner, which was a man from the neighborhood who had saw Rakie walking around by his lonesome that night. After calling the police, McMahon showed up. As he sat inside the home, the patrolman reported that Rakie had a slight bump on his head from where his mother had hit him with the broomstick, further saying that Rakie wasn't able to get into the house, implying that his mother Barbara had locked him outside all night as a form of punishment after leaving earlier. This is all after Mosley School medical staff said that there were no visible marks left behind. Rakie informed them that the reason she hit him was because she believed that he had broken a decoration belonging to her boyfriend. So Rakie was then taken to the police station where his mother was called. When his mother was informed that they needed to arrange for Rakie a place to stay, this was her response, and I quote, "I'm in bed, and I don't care what y'all do with my son," and hung up the phone right after. The next day, the woman who handled the case named Miss Hash completed the paperwork verifying that Rakie was abused and should be protected by the juvenile justice system. A hearing was scheduled for that next Wednesday on November 2nd, where Rakie's mother Barbara would be summoned to court. On that day, the attorney for the city's welfare department asked that the petition Miss Hash requested to be changed, so the department no longer was alleging Rakie was abused, and all they wanted was a decision on who should have custody of him. But Rakie would say under oath during his testimony that he's been beaten by his mother's boyfriend more than 20 times, and all those beatings were by the man's fist. Even then, as the court hearing progressed, the welfare attorney asked that the whole matter be dismissed, and there was nothing that Judge Ruby could do but give custody of Rakie back to his mother. So 2 hours later, the hearing was over, and the judge would meet Rakie again, who sat inside the waiting area alone. Turns out he and his mother had an argument outside the court, and she would leave him there after Rakie refused to go home with her. So Miss Hash then called Rakie's mother, but got no answer. Then she called again and left a message about the afternoon's hearing. She wrote up another petition, alleged that Rakie was neglected by his mother, abused by her boyfriend, and also hadn't eaten that day. She ended the petition with saying the weather that night would be too cold for him to roam the streets till the following morning, something Rakie was accustomed to when he refused to go home. Judge Ruby scheduled a hearing for the next day so the mother could attend, but Miss Taylor didn't show up. Miss Hash would actually visit Rakie's mother to inquire about what happened, and her response was that she had to go to work and was unable to come to court. The ending results, the judge gave custody of Rakie to Richmond's Department of Social Services. They would check with Oasis House, which was a local emergency shelter for teens, about housing Rakie temporarily. But due to past problems with Rakie, Oasis House refused to take him in this time around. Rakie was then sent to the Home for Boys emergency shelter, and Rakie wouldn't have any less chill as he did at the last place. He cursed out the staff, disobeyed the rules, and refused to adhere to any authority figures in the facility. This young boy was hurting, but in the environment he's now accustomed to, it was considered weak to cry, overly sensitive to yearn for love. So he expressed all of those feelings through his aggression. Now, just 18 days after arriving at the shelter, Rakie was transferred to the Human Services Intake Center in Manassas, but it's unknown how long he stayed there. 2 months later, crossing over into the new year of 1984, the family began to meet with the counselor. But by the end of March, him and his mother would abruptly stop going. Reason being, Barbara didn't like the counselor, who implied that she was being an irresponsible mother. Now, one could argue the hardships of single motherhood without any help from the father can push a woman to be impatient, inattentive, or less nurturing. And on the other hand, folks could say it was her own bad choices to keep bearing children while presently struggling with the few she already had. But as always, we speculate, as outsiders do. So who knows what's real and what's not? Either way, it seemed as if Rakie's pleas were going unheard. During that same month of March, about 2 weeks before Rakie and his mother stopped going to counseling sessions, the Flax family are on the prowl for some get back against the Johnson family. By now, and even before the war, the Brown brothers were close-knit with the Johnson brothers. So as the old saying goes, if they got beef with you, then they got beef with me. Was how the Brown brothers carried it from then on out. On March 10th, 1994, it's around 6:30 in the morning in the middle of spring, and one of Eugene's guys, 22-year-old Sylvester Leon Montague, will be outside an apartment in the Blackwell housing projects. He was on the 2200 block of Dinwiddie Avenue, changing a tire on his car. Then without warning or hesitation, an unknown man wielding a shotgun guns him down, shooting him in the chest, back, and arms, making sure that Sylvester would be pronounced dead on arrival. Until this day, no one has been charged for his murder, but everyone who's supposed to know knows exactly why he died that day, marking him down as the second documented death of this war. This was the same man who attempted to murder Daniel Flax alongside Eugene Johnson almost a year ago. Eugene was caught yet again after the ordeal, and Daniel still being alive will create a face-off in court as Eugene took his chances at yet another trial. Just a few months later, on September 25th, he wasn't as lucky as he had been with the last jury. Now, he admitted to shooting Daniel in court, but he claimed that he had done so in self-defense. He in fact said that he and the Flax brothers and their friends had been beating one another up and shooting at one another for years. Eugene and those testifying on his behalf, and even his lawyer, Willis Hutchins, asked for a delay because the witnesses he wanted to talk to were in hiding. No one had been able to find them, basically using the same angle as he did with James Bowers, of him being in fear of his enemy. At cross-examination, Eugene and his lawyer had this exchange. Eugene, were you afraid of Daniel Flax? Eugene's response, I like living. Willis then asked again, were you afraid of Daniel Flax? And Eugene, I was afraid. I know what he would try to do. The court really doesn't know what was going on. The only people that know is the people that's involved. And because I am the main person, they wanted to kill me. Now, I don't want to stay around when they catch you coming in the courtroom. After there were two more testifying on behalf of Eugene and also saying that they were afraid of Flax, which were Dale Montague, no relation to Sylvester, and Andre Harris. But no amount of dancing around the truth would save Eugene, as he was sentenced to 12 years in jail following the attempted murder of Daniel Flax. So as their leader, Eugene Johnson, temporarily disappeared from the center of the drug wars, his lieutenants, which was his brothers Reginald and Herbert Johnson, then the Brown brothers and Rakie Cloyd, would later in the year demonstrate that same force on the streets, maybe even more. But just as they gave it up, the streets would give it back, just the same. Now, several months later, after Rakie's 14th birthday, he's now attending high school. But again, he gets into a domestic dispute with his mother. But this time around, Rakie was the one raising his hand. And we can only imagine how shocked, angry, and confused Barbara had to be after being struck by her own child. I couldn't find the reason why, but she'd let a month go by before pressing charges on Rakie. But a full year would go by before anything would happen from that situation. So even while running the streets, Rakie would still attend school at John F. Kennedy High, which was located in East Highland Park, a name that has been changed numerous times. The school was originally named Richmond Colored High in the 1880s. Then it was renamed Armstrong High in 1909. In 1979, Armstrong High and John F. Kennedy merged to form the Armstrong Kennedy High School complex, which was during the days of Rakie Cloyd's attendance. Now, Rakie Cloyd's teachers and the school officials will report back that Rakie was becoming increasingly violent. Normally, kids with behavioral problems at school would be sent to the counselor, but upon finding out he was being counseled at home, along with his mother, who had stopped the sessions because of her own selfish needs, they were at an impasse. There was definitely an internal problem at home. Now, finding a way to combat said problem, especially back in these days, were next to impossible. Now, the year was almost to a close, and Rakie had completely broken his mold. Around this time is when he started hanging out on the south side of town more often, specifically on Chicago Avenue inside the Blackwell projects. He came into contact with the younger guys from the Johnson and Brown families, which were Herbert Johnson, Clayton Brown, and Carlton Brown. It's unclear on the exact date and time when they were acquainted, but it's believed to be the end of '84 through the beginning of '85. And I say again, that part is an assumption, not a fact. But this newfound connection would kick off a very lucrative but vicious run for Rakie and the Johnson Brown clans. Because whether he knew it or not, he had unofficially joined forces alongside them in this war inside Blackwell. And on the day of November 4th, 1984, Rakie Cloyd would catch his first known documented body. This was a death with little to no information about it, just that his name was Calvin Dale Mills, and 23 years old when Rakie took his life. During 1985 throughout the 90s, a detective by the name of C.T. Woody investigated countless murders during this war, and one person he bumped into a lot was Rakie himself. There were times he was investigating Rakie without knowing he was the actual suspect, but there was wholesome times also where he genuinely wanted to help this kid. But his efforts, like many others, were wasted, because by his mid to late teens, Rakie was already gone.
Talk, no comment though. chasing my dreams, my nightmares ain't got no money. Just a cardboard sign and they existing so bummy. And they want me down with them at the bottom of the barrel. I don't want no parts of it. For that life I never settle, so I go all in that bit. Want all my